The lobby of Ardent Global was a cathedral of glass and steel, polished to the point where even anxiety seemed to reflect off the marble floors. And at precisely 8:07 a.m., as executives hurried past with tablets in hand and assistants whispered into headsets, no one noticed the little girl standing near the security desk except the guards, who assumed she belonged to someone important because children didn't wander into billion-dollar headquarters by accident. Yet she stood there alone, clutching a faded pink backpack with one strap torn, her dark hair slightly tangled, eyes too serious for someone who couldn't have been more than 7, and she watched the elevators with the quiet patience of a child who had learned that asking loudly never helped, only waiting did. Upstairs, in the topmost executive suite, Daniel Crestwood, CEO media favorite, and the kind of man whose signature could move markets, was halfway through a board call when irritation flickered across his face. Not because of the numbers on the screen, but because he hadn't slept. Because despite his success, despite the penthouse apartment and the chauffeured car waiting downstairs, there were nights when the silence reminded him of things he'd buried long ago. Things like a small apartment that smelled of antiseptic and a woman coughing behind a thin bedroom door, memories he'd trained himself to outrun with ambition. And as the call droned on, a soft interruption rippled through the lobby when the little girl finally spoke, her voice barely louder. Then a breath as she tugged on the sleeve of a junior receptionist and whispered, "Sir, my mom isn't waking up." Words so gentle they almost disappeared into the air, yet something about the way she said them, calm, practiced as if fear had already exhausted itself, made the receptionist's smile falter. As she crouched down, asking questions, the girl answered with nods and short phrases, explaining that her mom had told her to come here if anything ever happened, that this building was important, that he would help, though she didn't know his name, only that her mom used to say it softly when she thought the girl was asleep. And by the time security realized this, wasn't a lost child situation, but something far heavier. The elevators were already opening, and Daniel Crestwood stepped out mid-call, irritation ready on his tongue until his eyes landed on the child, because there are moments in life when time tightens, when the present suddenly pulls an old memory out of hiding, and Daniel felt that pull as the little girl looked up at him, her gaze steady, her hands shaking just enough to betray the fear she refused to show, and she took one step forward, then another, until she stood before him and whispered the words again, directly this time, "Sir, my mom isn't waking up," and something inside Daniel froze. Terror, echoed too closely to a night he'd spent, kneeling on a kitchen floor decades earlier, calling emergency services while his own mother lay unresponsive, and without realizing it, he ended the call, the board forgotten, the assistant stunned into silence as he crouched down to meet the child at eye level, his voice lower, steadier than he felt as he asked her name, how old she was, where her mother was, and when she answered, "Lily, 7. Our apartment," he didn't hesitate, didn't ask his lawyers, didn't delegate. He stood and said words no one had ever heard him say in a crisis, words that didn't come from training or PR instinct, but from somewhere raw and buried. "Take me to her." And the lobby held its breath. As the most powerful man in the building walked, hand in hand with a little girl who smelled faintly of soap and old crayons, his tailored suit brushing against her worn sleeve, the contrast so stark it felt unreal. And during the ride down in the private elevator, Lily spoke quietly, telling him her mom had been tired lately, working extra shifts, smiling even when she winced, that this morning she hadn't answered when Lily shook her shoulder. And Daniel listened, every word tightening the knot in his chest, because fatigue, pain masked by smiles, promises made to children, these were things he knew too well. And as the car sped through the city, past streets Daniel hadn't visited in years, the skyline shifting from glass towers to aging brick, Lily leaned her head against the seat and whispered almost apologetically, "She told me not to be scared," and Daniel closed his eyes for a second, remembering a woman who had told him the same thing once. And when they reached the building, a narrow walk-up with flickering lights and peeling paint, he didn't wait for security, didn't wait for the driver to open the door. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time until they reached a small apartment that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and instant noodles, and inside, on a thin couch beneath a crocheted blanket, lay a woman whose face Daniel recognized before his brain could make sense of it, Recognition slamming into him with such force he staggered, because the woman was Anna, the intern he'd once known. The woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation years ago. The woman who had smiled at him through exhaustion and never asked for anything. And now she lay still. Lips pale, breathing shallow, and the room seemed to tilt as Daniel knelt beside her, checking for a pulse with trembling fingers, his voice breaking as he called emergency services himself, while Lily stood in the doorway watching him with eyes full of trust. And as sirens wailed in the distance, Daniel realized this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a child asking for help. This was the past catching up, demanding to be seen. And as he squeezed Anna's hand and whispered her name, promising help he should have given long ago, he didn't know yet how. Deeply, this moment would change everything he thought he was. But if this story is already tightening your chest, if you believe that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel, because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that compassion can still stop even the most powerful people in their tracks, and you won't want to miss what happens next.